The coffee cup shattered against the trauma room floor. But it wasn't the crash that silenced the emergency department at Metropolitan General Hospital. It was the sight of Dr. Maya Santos standing over the broken ceramic, her hands trembling so violently that she couldn't grip the simplest objects. For 6 months, the trauma team had watched her shake, stumble, and crumble under pressure, writing her off as the liability who somehow slipped through HR's screening process. But when 3 military helicopters descended on the hospital parking lot like mechanical thunder, and a team of Marine Force recon operatives stormed through the doors demanding, "Angel 7!" everyone realized they had been catastrophically wrong about the quiet nurse with the unsteady hands. Hey, before we dive into this incredible story, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you love these real-life military and medical drama stories that prove heroes hide in the most unexpected places. The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General's trauma bay cast their cold, unforgiving glow over everything, turning the pristine white walls into something that felt more like a prison than a place of healing. Dr. Maya Santos stood at the supply station, her small frame hunched over a medication cart, trying for the 3rd time to draw up a simple dose of morphine. Her hands betrayed her again, shaking with that familiar tremor that had earned her nothing but contempt from the day she'd started working here. "Santos, move away from that cart before you kill someone." The voice belonged to Dr. Richard Blackwood, the trauma department's head surgeon, and a man who wore his arrogance like a perfectly pressed lab coat. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of commanding presence that medical students worshipped and nurses feared. "I've told you before, medication preparation requires steady hands. You clearly don't have them." Maya stepped back, her dark eyes focused on the floor. She was 34, though the perpetual exhaustion etched into her features made her look older. Her black hair was pulled back into a tight bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her scrubs hung loose on her small frame. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to compensate for a body that no longer obeyed her completely. "I'm sorry, Dr. Blackwood," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I just need a moment to...
"You need a moment to find a new career," Blackwood interrupted, his voice carrying across the trauma bay. Several nurses looked up from their stations, watching the familiar scene unfold. "This is your final warning, Santos. One more incident of incompetence, and you're out. I will not have a liability in my trauma department." Nurse Jennifer Walsh, a blonde woman in her late 20s with the kind of confidence Maya envied, snickered from behind the central station. "Maybe she should try pediatrics," Jennifer whispered to her colleague, loud enough for Maya to hear. "At least if she drops something there, it's just juice boxes and Band-Aids." The other staff members chuckled, and Maya felt the familiar burn of shame in her chest. She had been enduring this for 6 months, the mockery, the exclusion, the constant reminder that she didn't belong. Every day, she watched as the other nurses were assigned to critical cases, while she was relegated to taking vitals, changing bed sheets, and restocking supplies. The shaking in her hands had started 8 months ago, and with it came the slow destruction of everything she had once been. But what none of them knew, what Maya had buried so deep that sometimes she forgot it herself, was that these same trembling hands had once been the steadiest in the United States Navy. These hands had performed emergency surgery in the back of moving vehicles under enemy fire. These hands had saved the lives of Marines while mortars exploded around her position. These hands belonged to Angel 7, a combat medic whose name was whispered with reverence in military circles from Kandahar to Fallujah. The automatic doors of the trauma bay hissed open, and Maya looked up to see the paramedics wheeling in their first case of the night. It was going to be busy. She could feel it in the electric tension that filled the air whenever the city's violence decided to visit their sterile sanctuary. "Incoming multiples," the lead paramedic, a weathered man named Tom Rodriguez, called out as he guided the first gurney through the doors. "Multi-vehicle collision on the interstate. We've got 5 criticals en route. This is just the first." Dr. Blackwood's demeanor shifted instantly. Gone was the condescending professor. In his place stood the experienced trauma surgeon who had earned his reputation through years of life and death decisions. "What do we have, Tom?" "Male, approximately 45. Massive crush injuries to the chest and abdomen," Tom rattled off as they transferred the patient to trauma bed 1. "BP is barely palpable. Pulse is thready. We lost him twice on the way in." Maya stepped closer to get a better look at the patient, her trained eye automatically assessing the injuries. She could see the way his chest rose unevenly, the gray pallor of his skin, the way his neck veins were distended. But as she moved forward, Dr. Blackwood's arm shot out, blocking her path. "Santos, you're on observation only tonight," he said without looking at her. "Stand against the wall and try not to get in anyone's way." The sting of the dismissal cut deep, but Maya obediently moved to the back of the trauma bay. She watched as Dr. Blackwood and his team worked, her hands instinctively clenching and unclenching as she observed their techniques. She could see what they were missing, the subtle signs that pointed to a tension pneumothorax developing on the right side. She could see the way they were treating the symptoms instead of the underlying pathophysiology. But she said nothing. She was just Maya Santos, the shaking nurse who couldn't be trusted with a syringe. The automatic doors burst open again, and 2 more gurneys were rushed in simultaneously. The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos as the full scope of the highway disaster became clear. Maya pressed herself against the wall as doctors and nurses rushed past her, everyone moving with the practiced efficiency of a well-oiled machine. "We need more hands," Jennifer Walsh called out from trauma bed 3, where a young woman lay unconscious, blood streaming from multiple lacerations. "Where's Santos? Even she can hold pressure." "No," Dr. Blackwood snapped as he worked over his patient. "Keep her away from the critical cases. Get one of the residents." Maya watched as they struggled with patient after patient, her frustration building with each passing minute. She could see the mistakes they were making, small errors that would compound into life-threatening complications. Her hands had stopped shaking. They always did when lives were on the line. But no one was looking at her hands now. The 3rd ambulance arrived, then the 4th. Soon, every trauma bay was occupied, and the overflow was being placed in the hallways. Maya found herself relegated to the family waiting area, tasked with the menial job of updating anxious relatives, while the real work happened behind closed doors. "Excuse me, miss," a voice said behind her. Maya turned to see an elderly man in a military dress uniform standing near the information desk. He was tall and distinguished, with gray hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of decades in command. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. A general. "I'm looking for information about the car accident victims. My son, he was in one of the vehicles." Maya felt her heart skip a beat. "I can check with the trauma team, General Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in his obvious distress. "My son is Captain James Morrison, Marine Corps." He was driving back to base when his voice trailed off, and Maya saw the fear that even the highest-ranking officers couldn't hide when their children were in danger. "Let me find out what I can," Maya said gently. She approached the trauma bay, but Dr. Blackwood was too busy to be interrupted. Through the glass partition, she could see the general pacing in the waiting area, his composure slowly cracking as the minutes stretched on. Maya made a decision that would change everything. She slipped into the trauma bay and approached trauma bed 2, where a young man in military fatigues lay unconscious. The name tape on his uniform read Morrison J. This was the general's son, and Maya could see immediately that he was in trouble. His breathing was labored, his pulse was weak, and there was something about the way he was positioned that suggested spinal trauma. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Blackwood barked when he noticed her. "I told you to stay out of the critical areas." "His father is outside," Maya said quietly. "He's a general, and he's asking about his son's condition." "Then go tell him we're working on it," Blackwood replied dismissively. "Now get out of my trauma bay." But Maya didn't move. She was looking at the monitor, watching the patient's vitals with growing alarm. "Doctor, his oxygen saturation is dropping. I think he might have a pneumothorax." "I think you might be an idiot," Blackwood snapped. His chest X-ray was clear. "Now get out before I have security escort you." Maya backed away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had seen too many chest injuries in Afghanistan to ignore the warning signs her instincts were screaming at her. As she walked back to the waiting area, she heard the first alarm from trauma bed 2. The monitor was beeping frantically. Captain Morrison's oxygen levels were plummeting. "He's crashing!" one of the residents yelled. Maya spun around to see Dr. Blackwood rushing to the bedside, his face pale as he realized his mistake. The clear chest X-ray had been wrong, or the pneumothorax had developed after the initial images. Either way, the young Marine was dying, and precious seconds were being lost. "Get me a chest tube kit!" Blackwood ordered, but Maya could see the panic in his movements. His hands, normally so steady, were shaking as he prepared for the emergency thoracotomy. That's when Maya's training kicked in. Years of muscle memory overrode months of conditioned submission. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that surprised everyone, including herself. "Doctor, stop!" Blackwood looked up, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. "What did you just say to me?" "You're going in too high," Maya said, her voice steady and calm. "The intercostal space you're aiming for is too close to the nerve bundle. You need to go lower, between the 5th and 6th ribs, mid-axillary line." The trauma bay fell silent, except for the continued beeping of alarms. Every eye was on Maya, who had just contradicted the head of trauma surgery in the middle of a life-or-death procedure. "How dare you!" Blackwood began, but Maya was no longer listening. She moved to the bedside, her hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably just minutes earlier, now perfectly steady. "May I?" she asked, but she was already reaching for the scalpel. Something in her tone, in the way she carried herself, made Blackwood step back. Maya made the incision with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure under enemy fire. Her movements were fluid, confident, and devastatingly effective. The moment she inserted the chest tube, there was an audible rush of air, and Captain Morrison's oxygen levels immediately began to improve. The monitors stopped screaming, and the young Marine's color started to return to normal. Maya stepped back, her hands beginning to shake again now that the immediate crisis was over. She looked around the trauma bay at the stunned faces staring back at her. "How did you—" Dr. Blackwood began, but his question was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the hospital freeze. It started as a low rumble, a vibration that seemed to come from deep underground. Then it grew louder, more distinct, the unmistakable sound of rotors cutting through the night air. But this wasn't the familiar whine of medical helicopters. This was something heavier, more powerful, more threatening. Through the windows of the trauma bay, they could see lights approaching from the darkness. 3 sets of lights, flying in perfect formation, moving with the kind of precision that spoke of military training and serious intent. "What the hell is that?" Jennifer Walsh whispered, pressing her face against the glass. The sound grew deafening as the aircraft approached the hospital. Car alarms began blaring in the parking lot as the downdraft from the rotors set them off. The automatic doors of the emergency department were blown open by the artificial windstorm, and dust and debris swirled through the trauma bay. Maya knew that sound. She knew it in her bones, in her soul, in the deepest parts of her memory. Those were UH-60 Blackhawks, and they weren't here for a medical evacuation. Dr. Blackwood was shouting orders, trying to maintain control of his department as the noise outside grew overwhelming. But Maya was backing away from the trauma bed, her face pale with a fear that had nothing to do with the shaking in her hands. The first helicopter landed in the hospital parking lot with a precision that spoke of combat-trained pilots. The second and third followed within seconds, their rotors still spinning as armed figures began pouring out of the aircraft. Through the chaos and noise, Maya could hear Dr. Blackwood yelling at hospital security, demanding to know what was happening. She could hear patients crying out in fear, nurses trying to calm them, and the general in the waiting area demanding answers about the military presence outside. But all Maya could hear was the sound of her past catching up with her at the worst possible moment. The emergency department doors didn't just open. They were kicked in with enough force to shatter the safety glass. 6 figures in full tactical gear entered the hospital, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They wore black combat uniforms with no visible unit insignia, their faces hidden behind ballistic helmets and night vision goggles. The lead figure, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, stepped into the trauma bay and surveyed the scene. His weapon was held at the low ready position, not threatening, but unmistakably present. "This is Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Marine Corps," the man announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "This hospital is now under military jurisdiction for the duration of this operation. All personnel will remain calm and follow instructions." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward, his medical authority clashing with military protocol. "Colonel, I don't know what this is about, but this is a civilian hospital. You can't just—" "Doctor," Colonel Webb interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to retrieve a critical asset." He pulled a tablet from his tactical vest and activated it, showing a photograph to the stunned medical staff. Maya felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the image. It was her own face, but not as she appeared now. This was Maya Santos from 8 years ago, in military dress blues, standing at attention with medals across her chest. "We are looking for former hospital corpsman First Class Maya Santos, service number 8847-2156-7739, call sign Angel 7, Webb announced. "Intelligence indicates she is currently employed at this facility." The trauma bay fell into complete silence. Every eye turned to Maya, who stood frozen against the back wall, her hands shaking more violently than they ever had before. General Morrison, who had been waiting for news about his son, stepped into the trauma bay. When he saw Colonel Webb, his posture straightened with military recognition. "Colonel, what's the nature of this operation?" "General Morrison," Webb acknowledged with a slight nod. "We have a critical situation developing 40 miles north of here. A Marine reconnaissance unit has been compromised during a classified training exercise. We have multiple casualties trapped in hostile territory, and we need the best combat medic available for extraction." "There are plenty of qualified medics on base," General Morrison replied, confusion evident in his voice. "Why would you need—" Webb's answer cut through the room like a blade. "Because the trapped unit specifically requested Angel 7. They won't let anyone else treat them." They say she's the only one they trust to get them out alive. All eyes turned to Maya, who seemed to shrink into herself under the weight of their stares. Dr. Blackwood looked from Maya to the photograph on Webb's tablet, his mind struggling to reconcile the shaking, incompetent nurse he knew with the decorated military medic staring back at him from the screen.
There's been a mistake, Blackwood said finally. Santos is just a nurse. She's not even a very good one. Her hands shake so badly she can't draw blood properly.
Colonel Webb's expression hardened behind his tactical goggles. He walked directly to Maya, stopping just inches from her face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Hospital Corpsman Santos, Marines are dying. They're calling for you specifically, by name, by call sign. Will you answer the call? Maya looked into Webb's eyes, and for a moment, the trembling in her hands stopped completely. She straightened her spine, and something changed in her posture. Something that transformed her from the frightened nurse everyone thought they knew into someone else entirely. How many casualties, Colonel? She asked, her voice steady and professional. 7 confirmed wounded, 3 critical. They're pinned down in a ravine, with no way out except by air. The terrain is too dangerous for standard medevac, but we can get you in. Maya nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that spoke of years of military training. I'll need a full trauma kit, O-negative blood products, and at least 4 units of fresh frozen plasma. And Colonel? She paused, meeting his gaze directly. Tell them Angel 7 is coming home. The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that the medical staff could only stare in stunned silence. This was not the woman they had mocked and dismissed for months. This was a warrior. Dr. Blackwood found his voice first. Wait, you can't just take one of my nurses on some military operation. I don't care what she used to be. With respect, Doctor, General Morrison interrupted, stepping forward. If my son's life had depended on Angel 7 instead of your trauma team, he might not have needed that emergency chest tube. He looked at Maya with something approaching reverence. Angel 7 is a legend in the Corps. They say she performed surgery under fire that saved an entire platoon. Colonel Webb was already moving toward the exit, speaking rapidly into his radio. Base, this is actual. We have Angel 7. Prep for immediate dust-off. Maya followed him toward the door, but turned back to look at the trauma bay one last time. Dr. Blackwood stood there with his mouth open, still trying to process what had just happened. Jennifer Walsh and the other nurses who had mocked her were pale with shock. But Maya's eyes found Captain Morrison, still unconscious on the trauma bed. The general approached his son's bedside and looked back at Maya with tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said simply, for saving my son. Maya nodded. He's going to be fine, General. The chest tube will hold, but watch his oxygen levels for the next 12 hours. Any drop below 95% and you'll need another tube on the left side. As they walked toward the exit, Colonel Webb looked at Maya with curiosity. The intelligence report said you were medically discharged due to a neurological condition. Something about tremors? Maya held up her hands, which were now rock steady despite the chaos around them. The shaking started after I left the service, Colonel. PTSD related, the doctors said. But it only happens when I'm not needed. When Marines are dying. She paused, her voice growing quiet. When Marines are dying, my hands remember what they were trained for. The roar of the helicopters grew overwhelming as they approached the exit. Maya could see the tactical teams preparing for departure, loading medical equipment and preparing for what was obviously going to be a dangerous extraction mission. But as they stepped outside into the artificial hurricane created by the rotor wash, Maya heard her name being called from behind. She turned to see Dr. Blackwood running toward them, his white coat flapping in the wind. Santos! he shouted over the noise. "Maya, wait!" Maya paused, one foot already on the helicopter's ramp. Blackwood reached them, breathing heavily, his silver hair whipped into chaos by the downdraft. He began, then stopped, struggling to find words. "I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry." Maya looked at him for a long moment, seeing something she had never seen before in the arrogant surgeon's eyes. Respect, and perhaps even a little fear.
"Doctor," she said, her voice carrying easily over the noise. "That first patient who came in tonight, trauma bed 1? He's got a slow bleed in his abdomen. His hemoglobin is going to drop over the next few hours. Don't wait for his pressure to crash. Get him to surgery now."
Blackwood nodded, committing her words to memory. "How did you know?" Maya smiled, and for a moment she looked like the confident combat medic she had once been. "Because that's what I do, Doctor. That's who I am." She turned and jogged up the ramp of the helicopter, disappearing into the dark interior alongside the tactical team. Colonel Webb followed her up, and within seconds the ramp was closing. The 3 Blackhawks lifted off simultaneously, banking hard to the north and disappearing into the night as quickly as they had arrived. They left behind a hospital parking lot filled with debris and car alarms, and a trauma bay full of medical professionals who were only now beginning to understand what they had lost. Dr. Blackwood stood in the artificial silence that followed the departure, watching the lights of the helicopters fade into the darkness. In his hand, he held Maya's hospital ID badge, which she had dropped in her rush to leave. The photograph on the badge showed the same face, the same dark eyes, the same determined expression. But now, he could see what he had missed before. The quiet strength, the unshakable competence, the eyes that had seen combat and saved lives under conditions he could never imagine. Jennifer Walsh appeared beside him, her face pale with shock. "Dr. Blackwood, I don't understand. How could we not know? How could Maya Santos be some kind of military hero?" Blackwood looked at the ID badge, then at the trauma bay visible through the windows, where Captain Morrison was stable and recovering thanks to a procedure performed by the woman they had all dismissed as incompetent. "Because we never bothered to look past the surface," he said quietly. "We saw the shaking hands and assumed weakness. We never considered that those same hands might have earned their tremors by saving lives in places where most of us would never survive." The automatic doors of the emergency department slid open, and Tom Rodriguez, the paramedic, approached with a clipboard in his hand. "Dr. Blackwood," Tom said, his voice grave, "I just got word from dispatch. There's been a situation up north, some kind of military training accident. Multiple casualties, very serious. They're saying it's going to be the biggest medical challenge this region has seen in years." Blackwood looked up at the sky where the helicopters had disappeared. "They're already on it, Tom. They've got the best combat medic in the business." "Really? Who?" Blackwood held up Maya's ID badge, and his voice carried a mixture of regret and admiration. "Someone we never knew we had." 40 miles north of Metropolitan General Hospital, in a ravine where 7 Marines lay bleeding and praying for salvation, the sound of approaching helicopters was like the voice of God cutting through the darkness. The wounded men looked up through their pain and exhaustion as the Blackhawks appeared over the ridgeline, and one of them, a young corporal with shrapnel in his chest, managed a weak smile. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to his squad leader, a grizzled sergeant whose leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. "That's Angel 7 coming. We're going to make it." The sergeant nodded, his breathing labored but his voice strong. "Angel 7 never leaves anyone behind. Never has, never will." As the helicopters descended into the ravine, the Marines knew that their prayers had been answered. The shaking nurse from the civilian hospital was gone, replaced by the warrior they needed, the one they had always needed, even when the world couldn't see past her trembling hands to the steel, steady soul beneath. Maya Santos had finally come home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Metropolitan General Hospital, highlighting the scorch marks left by military helicopter rotors and the debris that maintenance crews were still sweeping up. Inside the trauma department, the overnight shift was ending, but the conversations were far from over. Dr. Richard Blackwood sat in his office, staring at a computer screen that displayed Maya Santos's personnel file, or rather, the sanitized version that had been all they'd had access to before. Now, with a few phone calls and the right military contacts, he was learning the truth about the woman he had spent 6 months systematically humiliating. Hospital Corpsman First Class Maya Santos, Navy Cross recipient, 2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Combat Action Ribbon. The citations were heavily redacted, but the few details that weren't classified painted a picture of heroism under fire that made Blackwood's own accomplishments seem trivial by comparison. "Doctor?" Jennifer Walsh knocked on his office door, looking uncharacteristically subdued. "The hospital administrator wants to see you."
And there's a reporter from Channel 7 asking questions about what happened last night. Blackwood closed the laptop. "Tell them we have no comment. Patient confidentiality."
"But doctor, about Maya, about Santos. What are we going to tell people?" Blackwood looked out his window at the trauma bay where Maya had saved Captain Morrison's life with steady hands and perfect technique. "We're going to tell them the truth, Jennifer. That we had a hero working among us, and we were too blind to see it." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Do you think she'll come back?" "Would you?" Blackwood asked quietly. "After the way we treated her?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that one of its greatest protectors had vanished into the night, called back to a world where shaking hands meant nothing, and steady hearts meant everything. In a classified location 40 miles north of the city, Maya Santos was exactly where she belonged, kneeling in the mud beside a wounded Marine, her hands perfectly still as she worked to save a life that hung by a thread. The tremors were gone, banished by purpose and necessity, replaced by the unshakable competence that had earned her the call sign Angel 7. But in the sterile halls of Metropolitan General, the questions lingered. How many other heroes walked among us, unrecognized and undervalued? How many times do we mistake quiet strength for weakness, competence for incompetence, warriors for victims? The answers, like Maya Santos herself, had disappeared into the shadows of classified missions and military secrets, leaving behind only the knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary people appear in the most ordinary places, and that we dismiss them at our peril.